The first thing every young spacefarer learned was not how to navigate a star chart. It was how to read the red line. It appeared on every official galactic map, on every navigation terminal, on every vessel licensed by the Galactic Conclave, a thick crimson border curving across an entire arm of the Milky Way like a scar that refused to heal. No coordinates were listed beyond it. No stellar surveys. No resource assessments. Just the line, and beneath it, in every known language of every known species, the same two words. Do not. Counselor Senka of the Vreth Collective had grown up staring at that line. As a child, she had pressed her four-fingered hands against the classroom star map and traced it with something between wonder and dread. Her teachers never explained it. Neither did her parents. When she was old enough to ask why, the adults in her life all responded the same way, with a stillness that frightened her far more than any answer could have. Now, at 43 cycles old, freshly appointed to the Interstellar Assembly, Senka sat in the Conclave's Grand Archive and stared at it again. But this time, she had access to the deeper records, the ones ordinary citizens never saw. And what she found, or rather, what she didn't find, turned her blood cold. The region beyond the red line spanned nearly 18% of the galaxy's habitable zones. By any rational cartographic assessment, it should have been the most contested territory in galactic history. It contained hundreds of Class M worlds, dense mineral fields, 3 separate stellar nurseries rich with rare isotopes. Any one of those resources had sparked wars lasting centuries. All of them together should have made that region the most coveted piece of space in the known galaxy. Instead, there was nothing. No territorial claims, no exploration missions, no even a single recorded scout vessel that had crossed that line and returned with data. She pulled the historical index for the border region, expecting centuries of diplomatic negotiations, maybe old wars over where exactly the line should be drawn. What she found instead made her sit very still for a long time. The record simply stopped, not faded, not incomplete, stopped, as though someone had taken a blade to history itself and carved out everything beyond a specific date, 612 years ago to be precise. She cross-referenced. She ran 3 separate verification protocols. The result was the same each time. 612 years ago, something had happened near that red line, and every piece of official documentation about it had been removed with a thoroughness that only the Conclave's highest authorities could have managed. Senka leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. She was a diplomat by training, a rationalist by nature, and she had built her entire career on the principle that every mystery had a mundane explanation if you looked long enough. She told herself that now, mundane explanation, and almost believed it. Then she found the last remaining fragment that whoever had done the scrubbing had missed. A single line in a decommissioned trade ledger from a merchant house long dissolved. A notation in a clerk's handwriting, casual in the way that only genuinely terrifying things can be casual. Dora Imperium, all contact ceased. As expected, do not investigate. She stared at that line for a very long time. She knew the name. Every species with more than 2,000 years of recorded history knew the name. The Dora Imperium had been the single most powerful civilization in the galaxy for 3 centuries. They had commanded 10,000 warships, subjugated 46 species, and bent the Conclave itself to their will. Their collapse was cited in political science courses as history's greatest cautionary tale about imperial overreach. A civilization that had grown too fast, spread too thin, and crumbled under its own weight. That was the official story, the story every child learned, the story in every approved textbook. But the trade ledger notation wasn't describing a collapse. It was describing a disappearance. And the phrase, as expected, written by some anonymous clerk 6 centuries ago in a tone of grim, resigned familiarity, suggested that whoever wrote it had known it was coming, had perhaps known it was inevitable. Senka pulled up the star chart again. The red line stared back at her. The Dorai's last known territorial expansion had been pushing toward that border. Their war fleets, the most formidable military force the galaxy had ever assembled, had been moving toward it when all contact ceased. She searched for any surviving record of what was beyond that line. What civilization, if any, had been there when the Dorai marched in? She found one word, buried in a fragment of a fragment, a single reference in a corrupted xenobiological survey from 700 years ago. One word, a species name. Humans. She had never heard it before. No one she knew had. She searched the entire conclave database and found fewer than a dozen references, all partial, all heavily damaged or redacted. Bipedal, carbon-based, single home world of origin, though apparently expanded since. Technological development assessed as, and here the text was corrupted, significant. Threat level classified. Threat level classified. Senka closed the archive file slowly. The Grand Archives hall was silent around her, vast and cold, the kind of silence that had weight to it. She sat in that silence and felt, for the first time in her professional life, genuinely afraid, not of what she'd found, but of how thoroughly everyone had worked to make sure she never would. Somewhere beyond that red line, in 18% of the galaxy that the greatest empire in history had marched into and never come back from, something was waiting. And it had been waiting, quietly, for 600 years. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from knowing something terrible, but from realizing how many powerful people worked very hard to make sure you never found out. Senka had felt that fear for 3 days straight by the time she found Grell the Unbound. She hadn't been looking for a black market archivist. She had been doing everything right, filing proper research requests, submitting data access applications through official channels, escalating politely to senior members of the Assembly. The responses had come back quickly, which itself was unusual. Requests of this nature usually took weeks to process. These had come back within hours. Access denied. Classification level insufficient. Please direct further inquiries to the Office of Historical Sensitivity. The Office of Historical Sensitivity. She had worked in the conclave for 11 years and had never once heard that office mentioned. When she tried to find its location, its mandate, its membership, she found a name, an address on the conclave's administrative register, and nothing else. No personnel files, no published rulings, no budget allocation, no record of it ever having done anything at all. An office that existed only to deny requests and leave no other trace of itself. That was when she stopped doing things right and started doing things that might get her career ended. Grell the Unbound operated out of a cargo hub on the conclave's outer administrative ring, a creature of indeterminate age and at least 3 species of ambiguous ancestry, who had spent 40 years collecting the things that official histories threw away. Not out of ideology or rebellion, Grell was always careful to explain, purely out of the collector's instinct, the hoarding compulsion, the deep, irrational need to preserve things simply because someone else wanted them gone. "You want the Dorai files," Grell said before Senka had finished her sentence. The archivist's 4 eyes blinked in slow sequence, a gesture that, in Grell's species, indicated unsurprised recognition. "You're the 3rd Assembly member in 60 years to come looking for those." The other 2 stopped asking after their research funding was quietly redirected. "I'd like to see what you have," Senka said. "I'd like to see a payment that makes the professional risk worthwhile," Grell replied. What Senka got, after a negotiation she would never describe in her official expense reports, was a collection of data fragments so damaged and partial they looked like the aftermath of an explosion, which, Grell explained, was precisely what they were. Someone had detonated a cascading data deletion protocol through the conclave's primary archive exactly 609 years ago. What Grell had were the fragments that had been backed up on secondary systems deemed too obsolete to bother purging. Scraps, corners of pages, half-sentences. But half-sentences, Senka discovered over the next 72 hours, could be enough. She reconstructed what she could in her private quarters, working through the night cycles with the concentrated obsession that her colleagues had always found slightly alarming in her. She had always been the one who couldn't leave a problem alone, who found sleeping difficult when something didn't add up. Now she didn't sleep at all. What she assembled was not a complete picture. It was more like a silhouette, the outline of something enormous glimpsed through heavy fog. But the outline was enough to understand why someone had burned everything else. The humans, she found more references now, jagged and incomplete. A spacefaring species that had reached faster-than-light travel approximately 800 years ago, unremarkable timing, by galactic standards. Their home system was a single star, yellow and modest, in the inner curve of the border region. Their planet, she found the name in one fragment, Earth, a word that sounded almost embarrassingly simple, had a single large moon, a dense ecosystem, a history of what the Xenobiological Survey called pronounced interspecies conflict. That phrase appeared repeatedly in the fragments and clearly meant something significant to whoever had written the assessments, though Senka initially couldn't understand why. Most species had histories of internal warfare. It was the standard path from tribal to civilizational. The assessors wrote about it with a gravity that seemed disproportionate, a recurring note of warning that she found puzzling until she found one fragment, barely 40 words, singed at the edges, corrupted at both ends, that put it into sudden, horrible context. Unique among surveyed species in that interspecies conflict appears to have accelerated rather than retarded their technological and organizational development. Each major conflict produced measurable advancements in military technology, medical science, logistics, and psychological resilience. The Dori Imperium's xenosociological team assessed this pattern and concluded it was a historical artifact unlikely to extend to interstellar conflict. This assessment was. The fragment ended there. She stared at the broken sentence. This assessment was what? Wrong, catastrophically mistaken, the most expensive error in galactic history. She found other fragments, references to the early stages of what one document called the human engagement, a phrase so bureaucratically neutral she initially skipped past it before realizing it was describing a war. The Dori's opening moves had been standard imperial doctrine, overwhelming force, rapid conquest of outlying worlds, severing of supply lines, psychological campaigns designed to break civilian morale within the first year. None of it had worked the way it was supposed to. The humans had lost the early battles. They had lost worlds. Their casualties in the first 2 years were, by every available metric, catastrophic. Any other species, the assessors had compared them to 6 other civilizations that had faced early Dori conquest, would have begun negotiating surrender within 18 months. Instead, a human military communique from the 3rd year of the war, which had somehow survived in the fragment collection, contained a sentence that Sang Ka read 4 times before she was sure she had translated it correctly. We have now cataloged every tactical pattern the Dori have employed. We will not see the same tactic succeed twice. Year 3, they had been taking catastrophic losses for 3 years, and instead of breaking, they had been studying, recording, building a complete picture of an enemy that outgunned them in every measurable category and turning every defeat into a dataset. Grell knocked on her door at the end of the 3rd day and handed her one more fragment, the one that Grell had apparently been saving, because even a black market archivist understood the value of a dramatic final act. It was a communication between 2 unnamed Dori admirals near what the timestamp suggested was the war's midpoint, roughly 20 years in. The tone was not what she expected from the commanders of the most powerful military force in the galaxy. It was not confident. It was not even afraid exactly. It was bewildered. They are not fighting to survive, one admiral had written to the other. I have commanded campaigns against 41 species. Every one of them fought to survive. These creatures are fighting for something else. I cannot identify what it is. My psychologists cannot identify what it is. It does not respond to any pressure we have applied. When we destroy what they love, they do not break. They become something more dangerous. I am beginning to believe we have made a mistake that cannot be corrected. I am beginning to believe they intend to outlast us not by decades, but by centuries if necessary, and that they are entirely prepared to do so. Sang Ka set the fragment down very carefully. 600 years ago, the Dori Imperium, which had conquered 46 civilizations without losing a single campaign, had encountered humanity, concluded they had made an uncorrectable mistake, and been correct. She looked out her window at the star field beyond the conclave station, and somewhere out there, past the red line that everyone agreed not to cross, something that had dismantled the greatest military empire in history was still out there. Still waiting. She needed to understand why. Grand Admiral Vothsaren had not slept properly in 4 months, and it showed. His officers had stopped meeting his eyes at briefings. Not out of disrespect. They were Krethal, a species that expressed loyalty through directness and insubordination through silence, and silence was what he got now from the finest military minds in the Dominion. They looked at their consoles, their data slates, the middle distance, anywhere but at the man who had just proposed the unproposable. The route is viable, Vothsaren said again, for the 3rd time that morning, because repetition had always been his preferred substitute for persuasion when the argument itself was fragile. He pressed the holographic star chart with 2 fingers and traced the path, across the conclave's outer transit corridor, through the Yeth passage, and then, briefly, necessarily, unavoidably, through the red line border region, cutting across what the old maps called human space to emerge on the far side of the Dominion's collapsing supply network. Briefly, he emphasized. We are in that region for no more than 9 days of transit. We do not stop. We do not engage. We are through and resupplied before the Threni coalition closes the eastern corridor permanently. Fleet Commander Reth, the most senior officer in the room and the one with the least patience for optimism unsupported by data, spoke without looking up from her console. Sir, with respect, the prohibition on that region is 600 years old. We have no contemporary intelligence on what currently exists there. We would be entering blind. We are already blind, Voth Saren said, and the honesty of it silenced the room better than any argument could have. The eastern resupply chain is gone. The Yeth colonies are burning. We have enough fuel for the main fleet to sustain combat operations for another 60 days, and after that the Threni don't even need to fight us. They simply wait while we go dark, ship by ship, in open space. That is the certain outcome if we do nothing. The human space route is an uncertainty. I will take uncertainty over certain death every single time. Reth finally looked at him. Her expression was the professional neutral of someone who had already accepted a situation they found professionally unacceptable. The Dori Imperium, she said. Fell apart from internal pressures, he replied smoothly, the same way he'd been answering that objection for weeks. 10,000 ships that size don't disappear because of an ambush. They collapse because the civilization behind them was already hollowed out. We know the Dori were in severe economic decline before their final campaigns. Whatever happened at that border, we were never given the full picture. Mythology has filled in the rest. It was a reasonable argument. He'd made it to himself so many times it had taken on the comfortable weight of truth. The fleet crossed the border on a Tuesday, a Krethal calendar Tuesday, meaningless to the universe but somehow important to Voth Saren, who had always found it easier to make terrible decisions on unremarkable days. 312 warships, the remaining functional core of the Krethal Dominion's military. He watched them cross the red line on the tactical display, one by one, their transponder signals blinking steadily as they passed from mapped space into the blank territory beyond. Nothing happened. The first day passed in almost unbearable tension. Officers stayed at their stations past rotation. Sensor teams reported nothing, no vessels, no energy signatures beyond the background radiation of ordinary stars, no communication signals. Just space. Ordinary, unremarkable space, indistinguishable from any other region of the galaxy. The second day, same. Voth Saren ate a proper meal for the first time in a week. He began to allow himself the private, intoxicating thought that perhaps he had been right, that the old prohibition was myth, that humanity, whatever they had once been, had long since faded into history. By the third day, the tension in the fleet had transmuted into something almost like relief, and the officers were meeting his eyes again, and there was careful, professional conversation at mealtimes that was almost cheerful. On the night of the third day, Voth Saren stood on the observation deck of his flagship, a vast transparasteel viewport looking out at a star field so dense it looked almost luminous, and he allowed himself a full, unreserved feeling of vindication. The galaxy's oldest taboo, it turned out, was just an old fear that no one had bothered to test. They would be through in 6 more days, resupplied. The war with the Threni would turn. He was still thinking this when every communications terminal on every ship in the fleet activated simultaneously. No distress signal had triggered it, no manual operation. Every terminal on every ship across 312 vessels spread across 40,000 kilometers of space simply came to life at the exact same moment, as though whatever had sent the signal had not needed to find them, had simply known exactly where they all were and reached out to touch all of them at once. The voice that came through was calm, unhurried, speaking in Krethal so fluent and unaccented that for one disoriented moment Voth Saren's exhausted brain told him it was one of his own officers. It was not one of his officers. The message was exactly one sentence. No preamble, no identification, no demand to turn back, nothing that could be construed as a threat and nothing that needed to be because the implications of the sentence itself, the casual, devastating, almost gentle implications, were sufficient. We know you're here. We've known since the first day. We were deciding. The observation deck was silent. Voth Saren stared at the star field and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but contained elements of both. The specific, vertiginous feeling of a man who has convinced himself a room is empty, turned to leave, and found someone sitting quietly in the corner. We were deciding. Not scrambling, not mobilizing, not even surprised. Deciding. He stood very still for a long time and thought about 600 years of silence, and thought about the Dora Imperium, and thought about an old Crethal proverb that his grandmother had been fond of. The most dangerous animal is not the one that hunts you. It is the one that watches you hunt and waits to see what you deserve. Then he went to his communications terminal and waited for whatever came next. The human ship appeared without warning. That was the first thing every officer on the bridge of the Unyielding Dominion reported afterward, independently and in separate debriefings, because no one quite believed their own memory of it. The sensors had shown nothing, and then, between one scan sweep and the next, a vessel was simply there, positioned alongside the Crethal flagship with the casual confidence of something that had always been there and had simply decided to become visible. It was large, not overwhelmingly so, not the planet killer that Voth Saren had half expected. But there was something about its proportions, the particular geometry of its hull, that refused to be adequately processed. His tactical officer spent 40 seconds trying to classify it before giving up and typing a 4-word assessment that would later become one of the most quoted lines in Crethal military history. Classification system insufficient. Unknown age. The age estimate from the materials scanner came back as a number that the system immediately flagged as an error, recalculated, flagged again, and finally reported with a small notation that translated roughly as, "This result has been verified 3 times. We apologize." The ship was older than the Crethal Dominion. Not the design. The ship, the physical vessel, hull plating and all, had been in continuous operation for longer than the Crethal had possessed interstellar travel. Voth Saren had precisely enough time to process this before the communication request came through, polite, standard frequency, the kind of hail that implied the sender found aggression tedious. The face on the screen was unmistakably human. He had seen the species in the historical fragments now circulating through intelligence circles, though the fragments showed ancient humans, pre-spaceflight, in contexts of grinding industrial labor. The figure on his screen wore none of that context. She was small by Crethal standards. His smallest crew member would have stood a full head taller, with dark hair, eyes the color of strong tea, and the expression of a person who had been in her profession long enough that almost nothing surprised her anymore. "Grand Admiral Voth Saren," she said. "My name is Ambassador Yara Solis. I represent the Terran Commonwealth. Thank you for taking my call." He noticed immediately that she had used his name and his rank correctly, his specific name. Not Crethal Commander or Fleet Commander, his actual designation. She had done this without asking, without hesitation, in the same casual way one uses the name of someone they've known for years. He filed that away and responded as steadily as he could manage. "Ambassador, I believe the appropriate response is to apologize for the incursion into your territory." "I appreciate that," she said, in a tone that was genuinely warm, which was somehow more unsettling than coldness would have been. "We're not here to make this difficult for you. I understand your fleet is in serious trouble. We'd like to help with that if you'll let us." He blinked. In 30 years of military command, he had held diplomatic discussions following unauthorized border crossings, and they had never involved an offer of help. "Help," he repeated. "You need a transit route," she said. "We can provide safe passage. We can also discuss resupply. We have facilities that could address your fuel situation." She paused. "We're aware of the situation with the Threnny Coalition. We've been following it for some time." Following it? Voth Saren had a sudden, dizzying perception shift, like a man who has been walking through what he thought was an uninhabited wilderness and suddenly notices, looking back at his path, that there have been footprints alongside his the entire way. "How long," he said slowly, "have you been aware of the Crethal Dominion?" Solis tilted her head, and the ghost of something moved across her expression, not quite a smile. "Admiral, we've been aware of every spacefaring civilization in this galaxy for a long time. The question of when we choose to make that awareness known is a different matter entirely." She tapped something off-screen, and on Voth Saren's secondary tactical display, a data packet opened. He stared at it. It was his fleet, his entire fleet, not the official manifest, the real state of his fleet. Every vessel listed by name, by actual crew complement, by actual fuel state, by the maintenance issues that his own logistics commanders had been quietly underreporting to preserve morale. The Unyielding Dominion's secondary coolant problem, which only 3 people in the fleet knew about. The Steadfast Blade's actual ammunition count, which was 40% lower than official records showed. She knew more about his fleet than some of his own officers. "We're not your enemy," Solis said, gently watching him. We've never wanted to be anyone's enemy, but we'd like to have a conversation, a real one, not just about transit rights, about something larger. Would you be willing to meet? Voth Saren looked at the data on his screen. He looked at the ancient ship sitting alongside his flagship with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. He thought about the message that had reached every ship simultaneously. He thought about deciding. He thought about a civilization that had watched the galaxy for 6 centuries, in silence, learning everything, waiting for what? The right moment, the right question, the right species to finally cross the line and sit down across a table. Yes, he said, I'm willing to meet. Wonderful, said Ambassador Solis, and her smile this time was completely unguarded, and somehow that was the most extraordinary thing he had seen yet. They had expected a fortress. Every member of the Crethal delegation, boarding the transit vessel that would take them deeper into human space, had prepared themselves for the same thing. A civilization shaped entirely by war, by the experience of defeating the galaxy's greatest military empire, and then barricading itself behind an impenetrable border for 6 centuries. They expected cold architecture, military efficiency, a society organized around the memory of an existential threat. The planet was called Earth. The name in the Terran language meant simply soil, and Voth Saren thought there was something quietly significant about a species that had named its home world after the dirt beneath their feet, not after a deity or a founder or a conquest, after the ground they stood on. They descended through cloud cover and came out above a coastline where a city met the sea with a kind of unhurried grace that the Admiral found immediately disorienting. He had visited 40 worlds in his career. He had seen cities of pure function and cities of extravagant display, cities that were monuments to power and cities that were monuments to efficiency. He had never seen a city that looked, quite simply, inhabited in the deepest sense of the word. A place where generation after generation had added something small and personal until the architecture itself had become a kind of memory. There was art everywhere, not in galleries, not in designated cultural zones, embedded in the city itself, on walls and bridges and the sides of ordinary buildings, in styles spanning what was clearly an enormous range of historical periods. A mural next to a transit station depicted something vast and dark and cosmic in a style obviously thousands of years old. Beside it, a newer work in colors so vivid they seemed to vibrate, showing what Voth Saren eventually realized was a star map. Their star map, the Crethal's own stellar territory, rendered with cartographic precision in the middle of a public street, for anyone to see. How long has that been there? He asked Solis quietly as they passed it. About 3 months, she said, since your crossing became a discussion topic. He stopped walking, a public discussion topic. She continued walking, and he followed because stopping seemed to require an explanation he wasn't ready to give. We're a fairly open society about these things. People were curious. There was a lot of public conversation about whether the timing was right, whether we should engage. And what did people decide? She glanced at him sideways. You're here, aren't you? The delegation was brought to a building that was clearly both a government structure and something older. The architecture suggested it had been many things over many centuries, with additions and modifications that didn't try to disguise themselves, layers of human history stacked visibly atop each other. Inside, the rooms were warm, full of natural light and what appeared to be actual plants, and staffed by humans who moved with the quiet competence of people who were very good at their jobs and didn't feel the need to perform it. Director Emeka Osai was waiting for them in the main meeting room. He was a large man, large even by Crethal standards, which was rare, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular quality of stillness that Voth Saren had learned over decades to associate with genuinely dangerous thinkers. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply present in the way that people are present when they have nothing to prove and everything prepared. He welcomed them with a warmth that felt entirely authentic, which Voth Saren found confusing because he had trained himself to distrust authentic warmth in political contexts. It was usually performed. This didn't read as performance. It read as a man who simply found people interesting and was glad to meet new ones, even in circumstances that could by any reasonable metric be described as fraught. They spent 3 hours in opening sessions, and Voth Saren discovered several things. First, the humans were extraordinary listeners. Every person in that room, diplomats, aides, translators, listened with a quality of attention he had rarely encountered. Not waiting to speak, actually listening. taking notes by hand, which he found archaic and then found he preferred because there was something in the physical act of writing that conveyed genuine engagement in a way that data slates did not. Second, they asked questions that demonstrated knowledge they should not have had. Not just about the Crethol, but about the dynamics between the Crethol and the Threnni, about the internal political pressures in the Dominion, about specific arguments that had occurred in the Crethol High Council, private sessions, sealed records. Questions framed carefully enough that they never constituted an explicit revelation of how much humanity knew, but questions that made it impossible to pretend they didn't know nearly everything. Third, and most significant, they were not interested in weakness. When Voth Saren's deputy began the diplomatic habit of downplaying the Dominion's difficulties, the standard soft peddling that preceded requests for assistance, Osai raised one hand and stopped him, gently. "We know what your situation is," he said. "You don't need to present a stronger position than you have. We're not looking for leverage. We're looking for an honest conversation." He paused. "We've waited a long time for an honest conversation with the galaxy. We would very much like to have one now." That evening, Voth Saren stood on a terrace overlooking the city and the sea, alone for the first time in days, and tried to organize his thoughts. Solis found him there and stood beside him without speaking for a while, which he appreciated. "Your people remember the Dorai War," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "We remember everything," she said. "That's not a figure of speech. We have complete records. Names, dates, places. We teach it in schools. We have memorials." She paused. 600 years is not a long time to us in terms of historical memory. We have national histories going back 10,000 years. He processed this. "You don't seem angry," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sea. "The Dorai people exist," she said. "They're a member species of the Conclave now. They rebuilt. The Imperium that attacked us is gone, but the people, they're still there. We helped them after, gave them aid during the Reconstruction period." She glanced at him. "Anger at the institution that attacked us died with the institution. The people are a different matter." Voth Saren stood there, watching the last light leave the sky above a planet called Soil, and felt the first genuine stirring of something other than dread. Not safety, exactly. Not comfort. Understanding. The beginning of it, the session had been convened in secret. Councillor Senka had requested it through back channels, presenting her findings under seal to a closed panel of 12 senior assembly members, the ones with the longest careers, the deepest access, and presumably the strongest constitutions. She had spent 3 days organizing her reconstructed evidence into a presentation that was rigorous, sourced, and as measured in its language as she could manage, given that the content was not measured at all. She watched their faces as she spoke and saw something she had not fully expected. Recognition, not surprise, not denial. Recognition, the specific expression of people hearing something they already knew at some level, had perhaps been trained not to examine, and were now being forced to look at directly. The Dorai Imperium did not fall from within. It was dismantled from without over 40 years by a species that had been assessed as a manageable target and had declined to be one. She walked them through it, the fragments, the reconstructed timeline, the communications she had recovered. The Dorai's initial campaign, overwhelming by any conventional measure. The early human losses, catastrophic and apparently sustainable. The shift in human military doctrine, visible across the fragments, from reactive defense to something that had no good translation in any galactic language. The closest approximation was adaptive pressure, a strategy of continuously evolving engagement that made it functionally impossible to predict what humanity would do next because humanity was continuously studying what you did and designing something specifically to defeat it. The Dorai had adapted too. They were not by any measure incompetent. They had conquered 46 civilizations using tactics refined over centuries. The problem, as one recovered Dorai strategic assessment put it with almost poignant clarity, was that every time they adapted, the humans had already anticipated the adaptation and prepared for it. It was like, the Dorai analyst had written, fighting a river. You could dam it here and redirect it there, but the water always found somewhere to go. And the more obstacles you put in its way, the more force it built up, and you could never stop it, only redirect it, and redirecting it cost you everything while costing the river nothing. Year 15, the Dorai had lost 7% of their held territory to human forces, down from their high-water mark of 30% held. They considered this a recovery. They celebrated it as a turning point. The recovered human military assessment from the same period showed they had intended exactly that, a deliberate pulling back to allow the Dorai to overextend on their reclaimed gains, which they subsequently did. Year 23. The Dorai's subjugated species began experiencing what human strategists had apparently been quietly facilitating for years: coordinated resistance movements, supplied with specific technologies and organizational frameworks that made them effective. Not human armies, not human territory, simply humans providing, with extraordinary precision, exactly what each resistance movement needed to become self-sustaining. The Dorai found themselves fighting 40 fronts simultaneously, none of which were human, but all of which had human fingerprints. Year 31, economic collapse. The Dorai war machine required continuous resource extraction from its subject worlds. The resistance movements had disrupted that extraction. The Imperium began cannibalizing itself, reducing rations on core worlds, conscripting civilian labor, concentrating resources toward military operations at the cost of everything else. Human economic analysts had apparently modeled this outcome with precision 8 years before it occurred. Year 39, the final military campaign. Not by humanity, by the liberated species, now coordinated, funded, and equipped. Humanity fought alongside them but did not lead the campaign, did not claim the victories, did not occupy the Dorai's fallen worlds. They were present and essential and deliberately not central. Year 40, the Dorai Imperium ceased to exist. The ruling political structure dissolved. The military surrendered. The subject species were formally freed. Humanity and its allied species occupied the administrative vacuum for a transitional period, then withdrew. The Dorai people, the actual Dorai species, billions of them on their core worlds, were not enslaved, not punished, not subjugated. They were given a transitional government framework developed by human political scientists, given economic aid, given something that Sang-Ka read 3 times to make sure she had translated correctly. Educational resources focused on historical accountability and restorative justice. The Dorai Imperium's atrocities were documented in full, published, made available to every species that had suffered under them. The Dorai people were asked, formally asked, not compelled, to reckon with that history, to learn it, to teach it. And apparently they had. Sang-Ka finished her presentation. The room was silent for a long time. It was Elder Vral, the oldest member of the assembly, a species that measured age in centuries, who finally spoke. The elder's voice was very quiet, with the particular quality of someone measuring each word for weight before releasing it. The agents, the elder said, their embedded network in the conclave, how long have we known about it? Sang-Ka met Vral's eyes. Some of you have known for longer than I have, she said. I believe that was also known and also managed, and that part of managing it was ensuring that no one asked questions loudly enough to require official answers. Another long silence. They could have rejoined the galaxy at any point in the past 6 centuries, said a younger assembly member, brash, relatively new, which was perhaps why she was willing to say the obvious. With everything they knew, everything they had built, they could have simply walked back in and reshaped everything. Why didn't they? Sang-Ka thought about the mural in the street on Earth, about Director Osai's careful, unhurried warmth, about Ambassador Soli's saying we were deciding in a tone that suggested 6 centuries was not, to humanity, an unreasonable length of time to take for a decision. I think, she said slowly, they were waiting until we had done enough damage to ourselves that we would be ready to listen. News broke on every channel simultaneously. Later, historians would note that this too appeared to have been deliberate. Humanity had coordinated the release of information about the Krethal meeting, the nature of their surveillance network, and their formal request for re-engagement with the galactic community through a sequence of channels that ensured the conclave had no opportunity to contain the information before it reached the public. By the time the Assembly's communications office understood what was happening, every species in the galaxy knew. The reaction was what one would expect when a sleeping giant opens its eyes. In the outer territories, celebrations, species that had spent centuries on the conclave's margins, diplomatically neglected and economically exploited, received the news of humanity's embedded agents with something very close to relief. There had been a witness, it turned out. Someone had been watching. Someone had been keeping records of what the great powers had done to the small ones. In the core territories, panic. The word had begun circulating in 3 separate languages within hours. A word that roughly translated as the reckoning or the accounting, depending on the dialect. Diplomatic channels that had been quiet for decades suddenly flooded with activity, as governments that had done things they didn't want recorded began the frantic work of managing a situation that could not be managed. Senka found herself, with a velocity that left her slightly breathless, at the center of all of it. She was contacted by Director Os 20 minutes after the public announcement. She had been expecting the contact, but not so quickly, and not with the tone of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment. "Counselor," he said, on a secure channel that her own encryption protocols later told her had been established using technology 3 generations ahead of anything in the Conclave systems. "We appreciate the thorough job you did with the archive research. The quality of your analysis was exactly what we hoped for." She processed this. "You knew I was researching." "We've been aware of your investigation since about the 4th day," he said, with the warmth of someone sharing a benign piece of information. "We were pleased by it. We've been waiting for someone in the assembly to ask the right questions. You asked better ones than the previous 2 who tried." She thought about the assembly members whose research funding had been quietly redirected. "You didn't intervene." "We don't intervene in things we want to happen naturally," he said. "Your investigation reaching its own conclusions was important. The conclusions mean more when they're reached independently." He invited her to Earth. She went. The formal engagement session was held in the same building where Vothsaren's delegation had met, and the Crethal Grand Admiral was there, looking somewhat different than he had when he crossed the red line. He had a quality now that Senka found she recognized, because she felt a version of it herself. The particular bearing of someone who has had a significant number of their assumptions about reality corrected in a short period of time, and has decided to find this enlightening rather than threatening. Director Osai opened the formal session by placing a data archive on the table. Not a data slate, a physical archive drive, the old kind, large and clearly designed for permanence. He placed it in the center of the table and let it sit there. "This contains 200 years of observations," he said. "Every major diplomatic negotiation conducted in the Conclave during that period, every military engagement between Conclave members, every treaty made and broken, every political decision that affected species without representation in the Assembly." He paused. "Every violation of what the Conclave publicly calls its foundational principles." The room was very quiet. "We're not releasing this as a weapon," he continued. "We want to be clear about that. We're not here to destroy governments or end careers or settle scores. We're offering it as the foundation for something different." He looked around the room, meeting every set of eyes in turn. "For 600 years, the Conclave has operated on the assumption that power is its own justification, that what cannot be proven cannot be punished, that the species with the most ships write the history." He paused. "We'd like to propose a different operating principle." What followed was 6 hours of negotiation that Senka later described in her private journal as the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced, not because of what was demanded, but because of what wasn't. Humanity did not demand territory, did not demand reparations, did not demand an apology, a seat at the head of the table, or recognition of their military capacity. They demanded accountability, an independent tribunal system, a framework for economic equity between core and outer territories, formal protections for pre-FTL civilizations, a complete amnesty program for species that had operated under coercion from larger powers, and an archive, a public, permanent, protected archive of galactic history that no government could touch and every species could access. The great powers objected. Not loudly. You could not object loudly when the entity making requests had 200 years of your private communications on a drive in the center of the table. But persistently, with the creativity of governments accustomed to reshaping proposals until they were harmless. Osai listened to every objection with genuine attention. He modified the proposal where modifications were reasonable. He held firm where they weren't. He was never cold, never threatening, never impatient. He simply continued the conversation until the conversation had gone where it needed to go. Late in the 7th hour, the representative of the Galactic Conclave's dominant power, a species that had shaped galactic politics for 3 centuries, asked the question everyone had been circling. "And if we decline?" Osa looked at him for a moment. "Then we release the archive," he said, "and we trust the galaxy's smaller species to decide what to do with what they find in it." He let that sit for a beat. "We'd rather not do that. The disruption would be significant, and a lot of people who didn't do anything wrong would be caught in it. We'd much rather do this the other way." He smiled with the same unguarded warmth that Solis had showed Voth Saren on the observation deck. "We've been patient for 600 years." We can find a path through this that works for everyone. That's always been what we wanted. The Great Powers representative looked at the archive drive in the center of the table for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and prepared to start over. 30 years later, Voth Saren wrote his memoirs. He was retired by then, living on a Krethal colony world near the now-open border. The red line had been formally replaced, in the updated galactic charts, with a designation that simply read Terran Commonwealth, open transit, and he had the luxury, in his old age, of thinking slowly about things he had once processed at speed. He wrote the memoirs honestly, which his publishers had warned him would be controversial. He described the fear he had felt when humanity's voice had reached every ship simultaneously. He described his own arrogance in crossing the border in the first place, the carefully constructed rationalizations, the motivated reasoning, the way he had wanted the prohibition to be myth so badly that he had talked himself into believing it was. He described the first sight of Earth with the particular care of a man trying to make a reader feel what he had felt, because he believed it mattered that they understand. He spent a long chapter on what he called the misconception, the way every species had interpreted the red line as the mark of a dangerous predator in its den, a creature that had destroyed the door and retreated to sharpen its claws, something that would kill you if you crossed because killing was its nature. We were all wrong about what they were protecting themselves from, he wrote. We assumed the border was kept because they were afraid of us, or because they wanted to be ready before engaging with us, or because they were building strength. We were thinking in terms of our own motivations, territory, power, threat assessment. These are the motivations of species that have always lived by the rule that strength is safety. Humanity had already learned that lesson and moved past it. The border wasn't a defensive line, it was a quarantine. They were giving themselves time to decide who they wanted to be when they returned. And they were giving us time, whether we deserved it or not, to be something worth returning to. Senka read an advance copy of the memoirs and found herself, at the chapter on the quarantine, sitting very still for a while. She had spent 30 years in the new political architecture that had emerged from the Earth negotiations, the Galactic Compact, as it had come to be called, imperfect and contentious and renegotiated endlessly, and nevertheless fundamentally different from what had come before. She had been part of establishing the tribunal system. She had seen two former great powers face genuine accountability for the first time in their histories. She had seen small species given seats they had never had. She had seen the archive, humanity's 2 centuries of meticulous, comprehensive observation, opened to the public and watched it reshape, slowly and painfully and irreversibly, how the galaxy understood its own history. None of it had been clean. None of it had been simple. There were governments that still resisted, still maneuvered, still looked for ways to preserve old advantages. Humanity was patient with all of them in ways that were sometimes infuriating precisely because the patience was genuine. She remembered, as she often did, the conversation she'd had with Solis on the day the compact was formally signed. They had been sitting in a small room off the main session hall, just the two of them, with something Solis had called coffee, which tasted like urgency distilled into liquid form, and which Senka had come to love the way one loves something deeply strange that turns out to be right. She had asked the question that had been at the center of everything from the beginning, the question she had needed to ask since the first moment she'd found that fragment in the archive. She had been building up to it for years and had finally decided that if she didn't ask it now, she never would. Why now, she said. You could have done this at any point. After the door I wore, you had the capacity, you had the knowledge, you had the leverage. Why wait 600 years? Why this moment with the Krethal, with Voth Saren crossing the line? Why was that the moment you decided? Solis held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out the window at the city for a while. When she spoke, her voice had the quality it sometimes got, still warm, but with a depth beneath it that reminded you, in case you had momentarily forgotten, that you were talking to a representative of a civilization 600 years older than the relationship between you. 600 years ago, she said, when the Dorai War ended, we had a choice. We were the strongest force in the galaxy. We could have walked out of that war and shaped everything that followed, set ourselves at the center of it. She paused. And we looked at the galaxy we would have shaped, and we looked at ourselves, and we decided we weren't ready, not in terms of power, in terms of character. A war like that leaves marks. It leaves you with certainties about violence that aren't entirely healthy, with a scorekeeping instinct that isn't compatible with the kind of engagement we wanted to have. So you waited until you were ready, Senka said. We waited until we were sure, Solis said. There's a difference. Ready as a threshold, sure as a process. We needed to be sure about who we were, what we wanted, what we were willing to do and not do, and why. We needed to build that into something stable enough that it wouldn't change under pressure. She looked at Senka directly, with eyes that were warm and careful and very old in a way that had nothing to do with biology. And we needed you to get to a point where the conversation was possible, she said. We needed the galaxy to accumulate enough harm that the species being harmed would be ready to accept a different kind of structure. You can't build something new until people are tired enough of the old thing to let go of it. She smiled slightly. 6 centuries of watching and waiting, and we got to see the Krethel, the most stubborn, most pragmatic military culture in the outer territories, cross our border not to conquer, but because they were desperate and had run out of other choices. A grand admiral who was wrong and knew it and crossed anyway because the alternative was watching his people die. The smile softened. That's not aggression. That's someone at the end of his rope reaching for the only thing left. That's exactly the kind of moment we were waiting for. You don't meet people at their best most of the time. You meet them at the point where the pretending has stopped. She paused one last time. We were waiting for the moment when the galaxy would be ready to be honest. Voth Saren crossing that border wasn't a military event. It was the galaxy finally being honest about needing something different. Senka sat with that for a long time. Outside, the city of Earth moved in its unhurried way, old and deep and fully inhabited, carrying 600 years of deliberate patience in every stone and street and mural on every wall. She thought about the red line on the star charts, the line every child learned to fear. The boundary 600 years of galactic civilization had treated as the mark of something monstrous, something dangerous, something to be avoided at all costs. Not a monster's den, not a fortress. A civilization that had decided, after the worst thing that could happen to it had happened, to be careful, to be honest about its own limitations, to wait and watch and prepare and choose, with the same relentless, methodical patience they brought to everything, the right moment to come back and try to make things better. Not because they had to, because they had decided to. She understood now why no one had dared cross into human space for 6 centuries. It wasn't that they didn't know what they would find. It was that, somewhere deep in the galactic memory, in the place where old fears live and are never fully examined, every species had always suspected, and had known, without being able to articulate it, that they weren't ready for what the answer would ask of them. The question of humanity was never, are they dangerous? The question was always, when they come back, who will we need to become? And